Hi, my name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and welcome to our online forum. The vital signs of the planet, CO2, global temperatures, and sea levels rising, are telling us that it is in the midst of a medical emergency. What does it mean to be a human being on Earth when every living system is declining and the rate of that decline is accelerating? Each year, we choose a theme for inspiration and reflection. And in 2021, our theme is the year of healing. What is our role in setting the planet on the path to healing? My guest this evening, Ellie Cohen, is the CEO of the Climate Center and a leader in catalyzing cross-boundary, collaborative, and just responses to the climate crisis. She is leading the campaign to help California, the world's fifth largest economy, to serve as a model for the rest of the country and the world. Earth Day is coming on Thursday, and we're blessed to have Ellie here tonight for a conversation about where we are today, where we need to be, and how we're going to get there. Ellie, it's such a pleasure to have you tonight on the forum. Thank you very much for joining us. I have had so many people talking to me lately just about how COVID has changed their situation. Oh, Ellie, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Isn't that the funniest thing?
Thank
we all
you
say
for
that all the time now, isn't it? Our Christmas card, I sent it out and it said, "You're on mute." But so much of our conversation these days has been about how COVID has changed us and how COVID is changing things. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the way that COVID is changing both the way things actually are in terms of the health of the environment, our perceptions of it, and just our prospects in terms of making change in the future.
Thank you for that question. COVID really represents the human impact on nature globally. We know that the virus came from bats in China and then was transmitted to animals that then people ate. And with our global economy spread around the world very, very quickly in a matter of weeks. One of the biggest challenges, I think, with COVID was how quickly it became global. And it demonstrated a principle that we look at in climate change as well, which is of these tipping points, if you will. So you get to the certain point and suddenly it's all over the entire world. And we have the same issue with climate change, where we have these indicators, these tipping points around the world, that something like 9 of 15 of these tipping points have already been activated that put us on a path for uninhabitable planet, essentially. And the good news, though, about COVID is that because of this emergency, governments all over the world put their biggest efforts into it. Scientists all over the world did. And then we had a positive tipping point where for the first time ever within 1 year, we have a vaccination available. It isn't available to all people in the world yet, but will be over the months ahead. And that fact that we can have that in our society and globally today that quickly, when before this, vaccinations might have taken a decade to develop, or sometimes several decades to develop. So we have the challenges of not paying attention to science, and we also have the benefits of science that have really allowed us to be where we are today, with the hope that we can get together in our congregations and our communities in person once again very soon.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're so right. Just to be reminded of just what an extraordinary scientific breakthrough made possible, a way out that we just couldn't imagine a year ago. We're in such a different place, I think, just emotionally, mentally, et cetera.
Absolutely. And I just might add too, it does show the value of science. Scientists who work in epidemiology have warned for some time that as we destroy habitats and we have more interaction between wildlife and human populations, that we'll see these kinds of viruses happen more and more often. So a lesson for us is heeding the science, just as climate scientists are telling us that we are in a climate emergency and we need to heed the science and we need to act like our house is on fire, because it is. And when we do, we can act on it, and we can be more prepared for what to expect ahead.
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree. I think it's given us a chance to kind of see a bigger picture of ourselves and of the world. And I hope that leads us to be able to be more bold in the steps we take towards climate change.
Absolutely.
What were
Maybe, I'm sorry, one
no, no,
other
no, go ahead.
thing,
I
one other thing to share on this comparison to COVID is the role of government. Because there are many people who say, oh, we don't need government. We can get along fine without government. But the truth is, without government and without government leadership, as we saw some this past year, it can be devastating and hundreds of thousands more lives lost because of it. But when we have government leadership and government investment at the scale that's needed, everything is possible. And that
yeah.
is absolutely true for climate change as well.
I especially feel like that. I think there's certain kinds of problems that only governments can solve. There's certain kinds of problems that the business can solve. But climate change, it just requires a lot of coordination for sure.
Absolutely.
What kind of child were you to kind of become the person that you are today? And just like how aware of just the natural world and ecology were you as you grew up? Like, what was your childhood like?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that I grew up in a family where, well, the most important things were my Jewish religion and Broadway show tunes.
Oh, that's great. I love it.
I really
great.
didn't have any mentor in terms of ecology, but from when I was a little kid, I just had this connection to nature. Ecology wasn't even what it was called when I was born, but what I loved was that interaction between people and nature and policy, frankly, and I have all my life. In 7th grade, I was very sure of what I was going to do in my life. I was
Yeah.
going to bring the Russians and Americans together through our common love of nature. And when I applied to college, I only applied to schools that had Russian and forestry. I never got to actually bring the Russians and Americans together that way, but I did follow my passion for ecology over the years.
Yeah, and I can imagine that life is long. There, you still may have a chance to live out your and you're bringing people together around nature. That's the first step. You're a long way towards your childhood goal.
And I have to say, Malcolm, I was raised Orthodox Jewish, and I went to a private Jewish school through 5th grade. We went to synagogue every Shabbat, every Saturday, and it really provided a foundation of very strong values, particularly around responsibility for the world around us, the community around us. And I grew up during the civil rights era, and it was extremely important that we participated in marches and demonstrations, and that we lived our lives in a way that respected everyone in our community. And so that was deeply embedded in us. And I, in my life, have married those values with my passion for nature and for the health and well-being of our planet. And as this theme of tonight's discussion is about.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of who your heroes were, heroines, heroes, just people you looked up to. Like, how did you find your way to imagining the kind of work that you do today?
That's a great question. When I was young, I really didn't have heroes. I was more inspired by that just regular exposure to those values through the synagogue. We had a rabbi who gave very powerful political sermons, which many rabbis, for example, during the Trump era, were a little more averse to doing and didn't want to offend perhaps some of the Trump supporters in the audience,
Yeah.
and which I found unfortunate, because it doesn't have to be about left or right or Democrat or Republican. It has to do with human values and how we respect one another and how we treat the planet. And so I think part of it was instilled from that rabbi's sermons. Now, as a little kid, I was kind of squirming in my seat a lot and not really wanting to hear what the rabbi said, but it sunk in.
Yeah, completely. It's the environment that forms you for sure.
It really did. And then when I was a little bit older, and actually the way that I met Loki Devone, who introduced us and helped me be part of this program tonight, was through some of political action efforts. And during that effort, I met a lot of people who had worked with United Farm Workers, like in the 70s, doing house meeting drives across the country to get people to boycott grapes and lettuce in support of better working conditions for farm workers. So in the early 1980s, I had the honor of meeting Fred Ross Sr.
Oh, wow.
Fred Ross met Cesar Chavez in the barrios of San Jose in 1952, trained him as an organizer, and then Fred eventually became the lead organizer for United Farm Workers under Cesar. And Fred, I was working on anti-nuclear organizing at the time. I was working to stop the placement of MX missiles on the border of what was then West Germany and East Germany, which meant that a hair trigger could have launched nuclear war. And I convinced him to teach me how to do the house meeting method that he had used with the farm workers so that I could apply it on swing congressional districts. And it was really powerful, and eventually used it with a group called Neighbor to Neighbor to stop US military intervention in Nicaragua and stop the Contra War. So Fred was really, if anybody, he helped me understand what I dreamed of. He gave me a structure for it, an organizing structure, a way to think about it and to apply it, which helped me enormously in my career.
Yeah, I like the idea of just a family tree too, of these techniques and approaches, that we don't have to invent everything just from nothing. That we're standing on other people's shoulders. And
absolutely.
So when did you kind of really become an ecology activist, or like how did that happen, in terms of just taking those skills that you learned from Fred and applying them?
Well, when I first came to California, I was studying butterfly ecology and was accepted to the ecology graduate group at UC Davis. I was going to get a PhD in butterflies. But before that, I had visited my AFS exchange student sister who had lived with my family for a year from Brazil. And I traveled 2 months in Brazil, and I saw poverty on a scale that I had never, ever seen before or even knew about. I just didn't even understand it. And it so touched me deeply. When I came back to the United States, I had a job doing butterfly fieldwork in Texas and California. It's the way I got to first be introduced to California, which was wonderful. It was a dream job. But all the time I had this conscience in the back of my head saying, you can't just study butterflies. You have skills that need to be applied to make a difference, not just for butterflies, but for people and for communities in our state, in our country, and in our world. And I decided not to go to graduate school and became an activist and on peace and justice issues and environmental issues.
Yeah, that's great. It's like a kind of conversion in your life.
Definitely.
I think a lot about just people's perceptions about the environment and how much that's changed over my life. I think that, in the 70s, we were concerned just kind of overpopulation was a huge concern. And then as we got into the 80s and early 90s, we began to realize that it wasn't so much that we're going to exhaust the Earth's resources, but we began to be aware of climate change through CO2 emissions. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just how people's perceptions have changed about the environment over time, and just what are we really learning right now that may make it be different than what we knew in, say, 2010?
Well, if you look back over the past few decades and we think about the planet, I think that most people viewed it as unlimited resources. You look out to the ocean, you think it goes on forever. It's infinite. You look at the soil, you look at the mountains, you look at the blue sky, and you think it's infinite. And we've learned that it isn't infinite. It actually has boundaries. And we as humanity tap into it and take from it and take from it and take from it, and we don't give back. At some point, it's going to be depleted. And so when we have the analogy to the health and well-being, as you allude to in the very beginning, you could think of the planet now as truly having a fever. And it can sustain life as we know it within a little bit below that perfect temperature and a little bit above. But when you get out of that range, it's bad news for life as we know it. The planet itself, truthfully, will continue way beyond. But the question is really for us who live here now, for we as stewards of life on our planet, what do we need to do differently? And I think that awareness has changed dramatically. I think if we remember and think back to just last September and that very scary Orange Sky Day,
right?
I would say that was a big wake-up call for millions of Californians, because for the first time, it wasn't just, we know people who had to evacuate. We know people who lost their homes in fires over the past several years in California. But now everybody was being impacted by these smoky skies. And I mean, there's studies that show that thousands of people probably died who shouldn't have, but from that extra smoke in the atmosphere. that really irritated people, especially those who are more sensitive. And so you just look at this whole thing and you think, okay, this is a warning to us, just one of many, but many more people, I believe, are aware of this that were not a few years ago, even not even just 2010, even 5 years ago, I would say, and really are taking this much more seriously, which they need to be. It is truly an emergency.
When I read about people in the newspaper who are I don't know, I don't know what it is. It's almost like a willful ignorance about climate change. I just don't understand that. I don't understand, what forces lead people to be in denial about such a basic reality that seems so evident now that we have so many studies and so much scientific consensus about it. Do you have a theory for why people resist believing in climate change?
Well, I think most people don't like change and want to stay in their comfort zones. I also believe that it is part of the quote unquote American dream or the American ethos, which is we can live independently, we can do whatever we want, and no one should tell us what to do, and we don't have to change our lifestyles. And truthfully, maybe we don't all have to change our lifestyles, but we do have to have big policies that do change how we are polluting the atmosphere. And we can do it in a way that we can sustain some quality of life for everyone. But especially for us in California, we are the top, all of us in California are the top percentage of the entire world in the way that we live. And we use a lot of resources, and we have to find ways to share those resources more equally with everyone in the world. We have the technology and know how to solve this. We just need the political will. It's a challenge, but I really believe people stay within their comfort zone, and people inherently, all people, I think, generally don't like change. But in the United States, it's this reticence to give up personal freedom. And I think we have to educate everyone and share our values that personal freedom means personal responsibility.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that so strongly. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those policies look like in terms of just climate change? Like, what are the most important things on the agenda right now for the climate, especially here in California?
So, well, as you said, I'm CEO at the Climate Center, and we work statewide with partners all over in business, in local government, in environmental justice, nonprofits. And it's been fantastic working with everybody. And so we're part of some statewide coalitions. One of the top priorities has been a bill that's called Senate Bill 467 that was led by State Senator Wiener from San Francisco.
Yeah, right.
And just the other day, it was in committee hearings. And even though we have a super majority of Democrats, it was defeated in that committee. So what would this bill have done? This bill would have phased out fracking in California, which is a way of bringing up natural gas and oil, and a very dirty way of doing it. And it turns out that fracking is only 2% of all the oil and gas exploration in California. But the bill also would have banned other forms of very dirty kinds of oil extraction that pollutes a lot and hurts the communities around it. The second thing it would have done was create a health and safety zone around oil and gas wells. And you won't be surprised to find out that most oil and gas wells in California are located in the lowest income communities, which are many times communities of color. And this has been around for a very long time. It really comes down to redlining and essentially locking people out of opportunities to live in nicer neighborhoods by making sure that certain communities couldn't have access to bank loans or other kinds of means to improve their lives. And these communities are where you see the oil and gas wells. They're often immigrant communities as well. So where are they concentrated? In parts of Los Angeles, in Kern County, in Southern Central Valley, and other parts of the Central Valley. And what does it mean health-wise? In those areas, the kids have the highest rates of asthma. You have preterm births. You have high rates of cancer. You have high rates of respiratory illnesses. So during COVID, it meant that many of these communities were even more vulnerable to having severe reactions from COVID. And so this bill would have created a buffer zone of a half a mile for these communities, because right now there are schools and playgrounds and hospitals and homes right next to where the wells are. And so it is a matter of human well-being and climate justice to make this happen. Even Texas has these kinds of health and safety zones around the wells. And it was defeated when we have a supermajority of Democrats. So what's going on? I'm sure you know.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I remember being in Houston and just having massive chemical plants and like very little zoning for people living very close to those chemical plants. It's a very serious problem in terms of environmental justice.
Well, Senator Wiener and others now have worked out a compromise to not include the banning of fracking in this bill, but only focus on the health and safety zone. I'm not too hopeful about it getting passed, but one of the things that people listening tonight can do is to write letters, not just to Senator Wiener, but really to the governor, to thank the senator for his leadership, but write to the governor, who basically during the Orange Sky Day said that he was going to ban fracking during that period of time when we had 3 weeks of smoke covered skies and just smothered in that. And he said, we're going to ban fracking, and didn't do anything to use his power to help make this happen. And part of the reason is the power of the oil industry in California. They're the biggest, most powerful lobby in Sacramento, the Western States Petroleum Association. Part of it is some of the unions, the unions that represent oil and gas workers. And it's understandable. Their number one job is to protect the income and the healthcare of the workers and the families in oil and gas. We understand that, but the writing is on the wall. Just today, actually, coal workers announced that they were going to support a transition, what they call a just transition to clean energy jobs. The union did, and we hope the unions here in California will start seeing that and take leadership in making that happen instead of holding on to a past which is killing people, especially in lower income communities.
Yeah, I think a lot about just, there's kind of a moral imperative for us to care for the planet, but it may lead to surprising ways of improving human welfare, like you say, of just alternative energies may be a lot safer for communities of color, especially that are located next to oil refineries.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things you've talked about in the past is just the way that California is and is not leading when it comes to climate change. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I would love to hear your take on just, in what ways what do we have to learn from other places, and what are other places learning from us?
Oh, that's a great question. I imagine for most Californians, we think of California as being a leader on climate change. That's what we've heard in the media, the national media, even the international media. I had the honor of going to a couple of the United Nations climate meetings, and was with 20,000 of my best friends from all over the world who are activists on climate change. It was amazing, really amazing experiences. And whenever I would say I was from California, they would look at me as though rays were emanating from my head and that I was some godlike figure. California. Well, what we've seen here in California is that in the last 5 years, we have not only lost our leadership position, we are seriously falling behind. So we're behind the European Union in our climate ambition. We're behind the United Kingdom under conservative leader Boris Johnson. We're going to hear this week from President Biden as part of his Earth Day International Climate Summit. The United States will be making an announcement about increasing our goals for 2030 for greenhouse gas reduction and other programs. What they're saying is, we'll see for sure later this week, but what we're hearing is that it will be significantly higher than California's 2030 goals. Mm-hmm. The president also has made it as part of his platform since he ran for president, that we have a goal of getting to 100% greenhouse gas free electricity by 2035. California's goal is not until 2045. Basically, we're behind in a big way. And we know that what we do, others follow. As California goes the world. And it is really true. In the early 2000s, we passed a bill that was going to limit tailpipe emissions. Within the next 8 years, about 13 other states adopted it. And by 2010, it became federal law. Yeah. And there are multiple examples of that. But when we don't lead, it's a problem. So we're the 5th largest economy in the world, and it's time for California to lead again.
Yeah, I wonder, just as you look around the world, I mean, when you gather with your friends at the United Nations, our Bishop Mark Andrus, absolutely, I think it's one of his greatest joys, because he cares so much about the climate change, and to be surrounded by other like-minded people is just like so affirming. But I wonder if you can talk about societies that have made really great advances, and what does that look like? Like, how do we get ourselves off of fossil fuels?
Oh, well, one of the amazing things today is that solar and wind are cheaper than any other form of electricity today in the entire world.
Yeah.
And so 10 years ago, when people were talking about, oh, we aren't going to invest in solar, it's too expensive, no one thought it would happen this fast. But it started with changes in policies at the government level, public investments and public incentives for solar and wind. And then the private markets took off. And that's actually part of the theory of change at the Climate Center that we believe in, which is that you organize people to put pressure on your elected officials at the state level and federal level. You change the policies, you invest big time, and then you essentially channel these market forces so that people can actually make money from doing the right thing, and you make sure that everybody can participate in the clean energy economy. And
Yeah.
that's what we've seen. And solar is a great example of that. And so
Yeah.
other countries, what does it look like? It looks like a lot fewer people driving cars. It's not only that we want to get to cleaner cars like electric vehicles or perhaps hydrogen powered vehicles, but I don't know if you saw the news this last week, a new study came out showing that there are billions of microplastics in our air, in our soil, in the bay. And what is it from primarily? From tires from cars.
Wow. Yeah.
So we don't need to be in cars all the time. Most car rides are 2 miles from your home. What we need to do is get people out of cars. So instead of trying to get a car for every single person in your household, we want to get it down to maybe 1 car per household, or even shared cars in neighborhoods. That's what the future can look like. That we have much better mass transit systems that we get investments from both public and private sectors. That we can have microgrids, which means we would have clean electricity produced right in your own city and your own neighborhoods, so that whether there's a firestorm or a flooding or PG&E has decided to turn off the electricity, whether it's planned or an unplanned outage, you can still have electricity in your neighborhood, and it's managed locally by local government and the community. And you have storage with that, so you can store the electricity overnight and have that available when you need it.
Yeah, I love those ideas, and I love. I ride my bicycle to the cathedral every day, and I'd so much rather travel. But I'm so lucky that I can.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the issue, is that we don't all live near enough to ride our bicycle to the places that we need to get to.
Yes, exactly. And that is another part of that vision, Malcolm, which is that we do need to stop the spread of our suburbs, and we have to leave open land open, because when you have that soil available, you can sequester carbon from the atmosphere. You can take back some of the climate pollution we've put in from burning of fossil fuels and cutting down forests and disturbing soil. And we're going to need to live more in cities and in more concentrated areas, and find ways to do it that are healthy and that support one another in community.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what part of what I think of as the joy of just like discovering new ways of living that we may not have thought before. But we were meant to live in community with one another, and this may help us to do that more. So President Biden has his big announcement this week. What advice would you give to President Biden if you could spend an hour with him in his office?
Oh, I would love that. I have to say, I had the honor of meeting him in 1988 when I was working on the Stop Contra Aid campaign. He was running for president. And I asked a question. He sent one of his aides over to me, and the aide said, Senator Biden wants to speak with you. I said, okay. So I went over and I met him, and he said, do you want to work on my campaign? I loved your question. And I said, no, I want to make a difference for US policy in Central America right now, but thank you. In hindsight, I'm wondering, well, maybe I could have had an hour meeting with him.
Yes, exactly.
Who would have known? But if I were sitting down with him, I think the most important thing, I actually think he gets it, is that we have underestimated the risks of runaway climate change. And that's really what we are igniting every single day by the way that we're continuing as a society, primarily with burning fossil fuels, but it's also cutting down forests. And we have to change that. We have to turn it around. And so I think the most important thing I would say from a California point of view, and what we've learned here in California about how policy is made here, is that we have to offer a way out for the workers who are employed in oil and gas industries. We have to address climate justice, because there is no climate solution without addressing climate justice. In California alone, we have 7 million people living within a mile of these oil and gas wells. And we know that freeways are right next to the lowest income neighborhoods. We have to address this, not just for the health issues, but for the health of our and well-being of our whole society. Yeah. If we don't address that, it's basically saying those of us who get to have 2 cars in the driveway and go wherever we want in the world, we're doing it on the backs of mostly low-income people in our own state and in other parts of the world. We have to change that. And so for me, it's 3 things: science, just transition for the oil and gas workers, and climate justice. And if we apply those 3 principles to every policy that the president is considering, then we can move forward. And I would say to him also, there are times to compromise, and there are times when we can't. And life is on the line. All life on our planet is on the line now. And while we may have people who are science deniers, it's time for us to move on and do what's right.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Climate Center and just how it came into being, and what makes you excited about it.
So the Climate Center is fantastic. The Climate Center was founded in 2001 by Anne Hancock, and they had wonderful successes in Sonoma County. It was the headquarters is in Santa Rosa. They won national awards for being the first county actually to get measurable greenhouse gas reduction goals in every city and the county itself. And I'd say the second decade of the Climate Center was focused on community choice energy. And you may be familiar with it. You have it in San Francisco, Marin Clean Energy, Sonoma Clean Power. In 2014, the second of these CCAs, you can think of them as public-run electricity providers. And whereas PG&E is a private utility that its number 1 goal, in essence, has to be making sure that its shareholders get what they want from it. Right. Whereas these community choice agencies and community choice energy are really in the interest of the public, and they're managed by elected officials and engage the public. So the second CCA was Sonoma Clean Power, that would not have come into being without the Climate Center. And since then, the Climate Center played a lead role in helping to establish other CCAs and bringing them together over the years. Today, just 6-7 years later, there are 24 CCAs in California that serve over 80% clean greenhouse gas free electricity to 11 million Californians, or a quarter of the state. It's a great example of our mission, which is in essence, speed and scale greenhouse gas reduction. Yeah. But the electricity sector is just one sector. We need to do that kind of speed and scale change across sectors in California. So we launched a campaign that we call Climate Safe California, with the goal of moving up our climate action timelines in the state by 15 years, from 2045 to 2030, so we can get to net negative emissions, where we are pulling out of the atmosphere more emissions than we are making, and putting us on the path to a climate safe future.
Oh, that's great. It's so exciting. I wonder if you can talk, are there any new technologies that you're especially excited about that help us in terms of sequestering carbon or in climate change that we may not have heard about?
It's a really interesting question. I believe that the solution doesn't lie in lots of new technology, that the solution lies in technologies and know-how that we have today. So for sequestration is a good example of that, Malcolm. We have 100 million acres in California. We did an analysis with our partners at the Carbon Cycle Institute and found that maybe with roughly a quarter of the state, 25 million acres on agricultural lands, on range lands, even on protected natural lands, if we manage these lands better so that we increase the soil organic matter, hold more water when it does rain. We can sequester a lot more carbon, and we can help sustain biodiversity and food security and water security for us all. There are new nascent technologies that they call carbon capture technology or direct air carbon capture. There are maybe 12 or 15 plants around the world that are just starting to do that, but they are very energy intensive. And a concern among our environmental justice partners here in California is that the same thing will happen as happened with fossil fuels, that these plants, these giant facilities, will be located in low-income neighborhoods or communities of color, that they will have impacts that will be negative on the people and on the environment. And maybe we'll need those 15 years from now to survive as people on this planet, frankly. But we have to be sure that those technologies are developed in a way that is socially just and appropriate and environmentally appropriate. And so we're not there yet. And the truth is, it's expected that we in California will pass this dangerous threshold of global warming, which 1.5 C warming, which is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warming, as early as 2027. It's a decade or two earlier than the United Nations first said for 2.5 years ago. So everything's happening much, much faster. It's not just about our children. It is about us and our children right now. And one of the scientists who led the study about that said, it's possible that the crops that we grow in California will not be able to be grown when we get to that point. We're in the beginning of a multi-decade drought made severe by climate change. It truly is an emergency. And, if your house is burning down, you don't kick your feet up and turn on the TV and
right, completely.
You get to work. That's what we have to do.
Yeah, I even talked to my children about the way I've seen the landscape change in my own life as droughts become more severe and the land just gets worn out.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have is a regular practice on the forums. We take questions from our listeners, and so what happens is that Rebecca takes all the questions and she sends them to me by text. So here's the first question. Then they're often really great questions.
I'm sure.
What do you think of Biden's infrastructure plan to fight climate change and fight for climate justice? Is there sufficient political will to pass this?
That's great. I think it's excellent. The infrastructure bill has incredible potential. We need to ensure that the funds are used in a green, climate-friendly way. It can create lots of new jobs by investing in climate-friendly infrastructure, and infrastructure is everything in that sense, from electricity production to buildings, heat centers, and all kinds of things that we need. So it's really, I have to say I was a little bit flabbergasted when I actually saw that he was really following through on some of these things. We do get a little jaded by some politicians who promise one thing and in reality can't follow through on it. Now, whether it can happen or not, it just, unfortunately, there's a great chasm in the United States Congress today, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of compromise at all. So, but I do believe the Democrats can pass it and must pass it and get that money out there to states like California, where we can put it to great use for clean energy development, for all kinds of things that can help move us into our clean energy future.
Yeah, definitely. Here's another question. Are you working with Debbie Raphael, the director of San Francisco's Department of Environment, to ensure the city provides sufficient funding for her to urgently move forward with the San Francisco's Climate Emergency Action Plan?
We aren't working with her, but I know Debbie and I think the world of her. She is a fantastic leader. What we are doing and what we believe is that we have to unlock these policies at the state level that will then allow funds to flow to San Francisco, to other communities across the state. We need people to act at every level, from personal, local government, state, federal, and global. But unless we have, as we talked about earlier with COVID, if you don't have the state government apparatus supporting this and the funds there invested in a big way, we're not going to be able to do at the local government level what needs to be done. So our work is not directly with Debbie, but directly will support her and her goals. And we are working hard to bring that money. In fact, Senator Stern from Santa Monica down in LA just introduced a bill that was catalyzed in part from the work at the Climate Center called Senate Bill 582 that would, for the first time in California's history, set a goal of net negative emissions by 2035. It's a little later than we think the science calls for, but it's a giant step forward. It also calls for just transition funding and investing in lower income communities. So we're starting to do that. And the more we have these policies in place, when the funds come from the federal government, we can direct them where they're needed to do the kinds of policies at the local level that are so critical to making the changes we need.
Oh yeah, definitely. How can we make climate change and climate justice an integral part of K through 12 education? I was going to ask you that question.
That is a great, great question. First, I think the story has to be told from people from those communities. I think it's really important. I was very honored in my high school days to have been part of a program called American Field Service, which was an exchange student program. And it allowed me to live abroad for a period of time. It allowed us to host a woman from Brazil. All of a sudden, the whole world was open to us. And it changed the trajectory for my whole family because we saw that the differences among people in language and in so many other ways were to be celebrated, not to be resented or hated or put down. And so how do we teach people about it? By talking to those people who live it and by having exchanges. And so we don't have to go across the world. We can go to another part of our own cities and towns and counties. We can go across the bay. We can meet one another and learn from one another. I believe that would be life-changing for young people.
Yeah, I like that. How can faith communities use their leverage to fight climate change?
Oh, it's huge. Well, you have to tell me, Malcolm, how many people are part of your church?
A zillion.
A zillion.
And people care so much about this issue.
Yes.
But I loved it when you were talking about the story when we were kind of warming up for the conversation about being asked by your rabbi to preach. That was a lovely story about how your faith community was encouraged and galvanized by a visionary leader.
Well, it's true. So I was working as the CEO of Point Blue Conservation Science, which was founded as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And our scientists study birds on the Farallon Islands and all across California and other parts of the West. And in 2005, there was complete breeding failure of one of the bird species out on the island. And it was highly unusual because it wasn't the typical conditions that would prevent food from being available. And it turns out it was this anomaly, but it happened again in 2006. And that's when we started seeing that climate change was already having a direct impact on birds and other wildlife in the ecosystems that we are studying. And as Malcolm, as you referred to, I was talking the ear off of my rabbi at that time. And it was the spring of 2006. And then Al Gore's film came out, An Inconvenient Truth. And I kept saying to my rabbi, our synagogue has to take action. It's unethical not to. We have to do something. We have to take action. And she got so sick of me talking to her. She turned around and she said, how about if you do the Yom Kippur sermon in early October on Judaism and climate change? And I said, I am not an expert on either of those. And I said, no, but after a few tries, I said yes. And I researched it all summer. And that was the beginning of my really understanding how fundamental addressing climate change is, no matter what sector you work in or where you live anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think everybody just needs to find their place. I mean, basically, I think what faith communities really do is I think of their primary ministry is out in the world, and your primary ministry is with climate justice, and other people's primary ministry is in city government, and other people's ministry is working, in all the different places that you can think of. But I think religious organizations are at their best when they can kind of empower those people to make those kinds of differences in their own spheres.
Oh, absolutely, Malcolm. And when you were asking me before about mentors, and I really hadn't thought about it before, that my rabbi as a kid had such an influence on me by the way he brought together religion and politics and moral responsibility. And I think there's potential for the religious community across the country to have a huge impact on climate change. But it's not enough just to talk about it. We have to take action. It's not enough just to have an electric car or change your light bulbs. We all have to take ownership of our democracy. And that means being vocal in the political process, That's where these policy unlocks will happen that will allow us to make the change at the speed and scale that we need to.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Here's another question from Loki. Climate change is so huge and seems so daunting in terms of fixing it. What can each of us do individually in our daily lives to make the necessary changes happen to secure a safe future for ourselves and our children?
I think, as I was just saying, there's several things you can do. There are things we can personally do. We can fly less until they invent airplanes that don't pollute. We can reduce the number of cars and vehicle miles traveled. We can use more mass transit as we get past COVID. We can do more staycations and make more of the time that we are here. We can talk about it with our neighbors. I've always had this dream of having precinct leaders, like you have a political precinct leader,
Yeah.
but having neighborhood climate leaders, where you prepare for emergencies of all kinds, but it's a way of organizing people to also take action on climate change. So in your home, you can have double paned or triple paned windows if you can afford them. There are programs to help people who can't afford them. You can change your gas stove and get an electric stove. And I can tell you that we've been very successful in cooking delicious meals on our electric stove the last 5 years, since we sealed off that natural gas, or one could say methane gas or fossil gas, because it's the whole process of that is very polluting and accelerating climate change. So there's lots of things to do on the home front. Even on top of that is what I was just saying, is that we need to take action with our elected officials. So if you live in San Francisco, write to Senator Wiener and thank him for what he has done with this SB 467 and all of his leadership on climate change, and tell him we need him to do more. We need him to accelerate timelines in California so that it's commensurate with the science and with the climate reality and how quickly it's deteriorating. And to Congresswoman Pelosi, and asking her to do more at the congressional level. And we need to go meet with them in their offices. Maybe there can be a delegation from the church to go there and speak with them. I think there's also ways to get involved locally. I live in the town of San Anselmo, and I was giving talks about climate change for years. Here's what everybody should do. And finally I thought, well, maybe I should learn about, well, what does it actually take to do that in my own town? And so I joined the Sustainability Commission, which we now call the Climate Action Commission. And it's been an incredible learning experience, but we have been able to make positive change as well.
Oh, I love those stories, because I think they really do give us hope. Here's another question. What do you think can help coastal urban Californians understand and engage in the important work of restoring the Central Valley river landscapes as green infrastructure for climate change, flood safety, biodiversity, community health?
Excellent question. Before I get to that, I have one more answer for Loki, which is I think it's also really important to be generous and support groups that are working on climate change, climate justice, and environmental issues. And you can choose the groups you want. Of course, I'd love for people to support the Climate Center, but whatever you do, we will use every dollar, we, the capital we in the climate movement, to make a difference. And we all have to be generous, and that's another way that you can help. So coming from Point Blue Conservation Science, we really, during my tenure there, broadened the priority of the organization to focus on nature-based solutions to climate change and what we call climate smart restoration. To be able to sequester the amount of carbon that I was talking about earlier for 25 million acres across the state, it means investing big time in new ways of managing agricultural lands, but also riparian and stream-side habitat restoration, which can sequester a lot of carbon and has all kinds of other benefits for cooling off streams, for fisheries, also for replenishing groundwater. And on the coastal ecosystems, the more that we can sustain healthy ecosystems, we can slow down sea level rise impacts on cities like San Francisco and areas around the Bay. So we want to, where it's appropriate, to have those natural wetlands that can provide a buffer to sea level rise. They can also reduce flooding impacts and also support biodiversity. And I just want to say, a lot of people think of biodiversity and ecosystem conservation as separate from climate change. At the Climate Center, we've brought it together because in the end, we will not, nature regulates climate, and healthy nature is what is needed. Nature also regulates disease and the spread of viruses like COVID. And if you keep destroying nature, we are making it much harder for us to survive. So we need to not only protect what we have, we need to restore for the climate and for biodiversity. They all interact with one another to sustain life as we know it.
There's a lovely question right here from somebody who writes just about the challenges. All his life, he describes himself as working as an activist and as a visionary. And he said that he asked, can both of you speak to some tools for staying hopeful around all this when even California isn't leading, even with a governor who quote unquote gets it? So like, what gives you hope, when you see the statistics and recognizes how severe the problem is?
What gives me hope is taking action. That is the single best remedy. And so I can just tell you, we developed this concept of the Climate Safe California campaign a year and a half ago. Today, we have over 1,000 endorsers. And I invite you, you can go to climatesafeca.org and you can endorse it as an organization or as individuals. We have met with over 30 members of the state legislature, presenting the latest science to them and a series of policies that they can enact to make the difference. And people are listening. Change doesn't always happen fast, but as we discussed earlier, there are positive tipping points. And you can bet that we're going to have fires again like we did last year. And every year they're going to be breaking records. And there'll be a point, a positive tipping point, where people will come together and they're going to adopt much more aggressive policies. It's already starting to happen. We have senators talking about net negative emissions for the first time ever in the state legislature. We have them talking about what needs to be done for climate justice. It's happening now. So I personally am thrilled by that. I am empowered by that. I am inspired by that. And I do have to admit, I was born with the happy gene. And so I am a natural born optimist, but I will share my optimism with others. I will always believe that we can make a difference. I've seen it before and we'll see it again. We have to keep at it and we know we can do it.
Yeah, and just even at the cathedral, we installed solar panels in the places where we could install the solar panels. We just recently went to all compact fluorescent, all LED technology, new lighting everywhere in the cathedral. I think one of the things that just I find inspiring is just, there's never been a time when all of humanity had to cooperate on anything ever. And so when you were talking about, like, there's been a fundamental change in consciousness. When I was a child, I just didn't think that there's anything that we could do about nature. I mean, it was just the wilderness seemed so independent and so vast and so unaffected. And we do have a different picture of things, and it's a smaller picture of the world, but it's also a more connected picture of human beings.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's another thing. It's just like about COVID. It's just like, no matter how crazy you think somebody is, or how off balance they are in terms of their politics, I mean, we're dependent on each one of us in terms of the progress of this disease and how each one of us interacts with each other and lives and the possibilities that they have and whether they're thriving or not. All of a sudden it really does, we've known that we're interrelated before, but this really makes that clear.
Absolutely. And a little different view on that, Malcolm. So there's no question about, so in one way, when you face emergency of any kind, whether it's a pandemic or climate change, wildfires, you find your common humanity. But there's a really interesting study that was done by a professor at Harvard that showed that significant social change happened with only 3.5% of the population. And that number applied in cultures across the world, very, very different cultures and different times.
Yeah.
And so that means that, because a lot of people say to me, well, how do I convince so-and-so to believe in climate change? And I'm like, you don't need to. What we need to do is talk to the people who already understand it, who believe in science, and who can take action and help people take more action. So it's interesting, but social change really happens with a pretty small number of people taking concerted action together towards the same goal. And then really big things can happen.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I feel about it too. It's just not everybody needs to be convinced of everything, and you don't have to appeal to everybody,
Yeah,
but to appealing to the right people and being able to make these policy changes basically that shape the direction that humanity is moving toward. That's what's most important right now.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities as we go forward in terms of what humanity is going to look like. But it's been such a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm so grateful that you made the time for us. Do you have any closing words for us as we wrap things up? Any words of encouragement or advice, or any thoughts or answers to questions I didn't even think of asking?
Well, first of all, thank you for including me tonight. It really is an honor. This Earth Day may be an Earth Week and Earth Year, because really it should be Earth Day every day.
Yeah.
It is a momentous time. And with the president's announcement later this week and renewed vigor from the United States and renewed leadership on climate change, we have an opportunity that may not come around again for some time to really make a difference. And what we do here in California can impact what the United States does. It impacts what other governments do all over the world. And I just want to encourage everybody to take extra action, do what you can from your personal viewpoint, in the community you live in the state that you live in the country that you live in, and as a global citizen. We can make a difference. We are making a difference. We have great examples around the Bay. The Bay could have been a river today,
Oh,
not a bay,
true.
had it not been for just a few activists who took to the streets and organized and used the political system to stop the Bay from being filled in. We have
Yeah.
example after example of that. We got to speak out. We have to take our democracy into our hands, and we have to secure our future. We have the know-how, we have the technology, and I can see that headline in the future that says California is the first to reach net negative emissions by 2030, that we do it in an equitable and just way, that our ecosystems are starting to come back and be healthy again. We can do it, but we
Yeah.
have to do it soon, and we need to do it together with that common vision.
Yeah,
So
you just
thank
have
you
to think
so
of the
much.
Pelicans and Rachel Carson and the
Exactly.
DDT, and look how many Pelicans
The
I saw.
Eagles. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You can see the changes all around us. Please join me, everybody, next week when my guest will be Andrew Solomon, author of Far from the Tree. We'll be talking about family. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK to 76278. And again, Ellie, thanks so much for joining us and being here tonight. We're so grateful for the work that you're out there doing in the trenches. We look forward to keeping in touch with you as you continue to do this important work.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everybody, for
much.
joining us. Yep. Good night now.